Jeff and Jody. Good morning, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for joining us for our Learning Shabbat session this morning. We had a wonderful night last night talking about our new publication, Contemporary Humanistic Judaism, and now we're going to do the opposite and talk about our oldest publication, which is the Torah. Traditionally, there's a cycle of studying the Torah where you break it up into 54 different portions, and over the course of a calendar year, cover the entire Torah. But there's actually two versions of that cycle. There's a 3-year cycle as well that breaks it up into smaller chunks. The point is there's no one tradition of how to study Torah, and we as humanistic Jews are not captive to what tradition tells us to do. The Torah is the beginning and not the end of Jewish wisdom. After all, in this congregation, the Torah lives in the library with other pieces of human wisdom. And so Rabbi Jeffrey Falick of the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism of Metro Detroit, Rabbi Jody Kornfeld of Beth Chaverim Humanistic Jewish Community of suburban Chicago, and myself, for those who don't know, Adam Shalom, Rabbi of Kol Hadash in suburban Chicago, and also Dean of the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. The three of us decided that we would choose a Torah portion to discuss today by interest and topic, more so than by commandment. The Torah portion we'll be discussing, and there are copies of the text on the ledge as you're coming in, if you didn't grab one. The Torah portion we'll be discussing is called Ki Tavo. It's Deuteronomy chapter 26 to 28 with a few verses of chapter 29. And the way this morning will flow is each of us will explore one chapter, and the other rabbis will respond after the presenting rabbi has talked about what they find in that chapter. And we'll open up to your questions or comments after we've reviewed the entire portion. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff. Thank you.
As we consider ourselves lucky if we have one microphone and it works. So, okay. So good morning, everybody. This portion, Adam allowed me the privilege to pick which chapter I wanted, and there was only one that I wanted. So that was good, or it would have been one of you guys doing this. I want to actually start out with a little bit of insight from a very, very important book. It's actually a book of essays, and it's one of the classics of Jewish literature. It's by a man named Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi. You might remember that name. I studied him in our congregation together. It's called Zachor, Remember, Jewish History and Jewish Memory. And in that book, throughout the 4 essays, he talks about the importance of both historiography, modern historiography, know what happened, and the idea that Jews have had throughout our history of sort of collective memory, storytelling, sometimes in the format of historiography, as far as they understood it, and sometimes to emphasize certain values, certain theologies, and so forth. This is what Deuteronomy 26 comes to us to say. So we're going to be looking today at what calls, and particularly with regard to this one of the passages here, a superlative example of the interplay of ritual and recital of our history. And we'll also look at how, after the biblical period, these texts, this one in particular text, became part of our collective memory in a different way. Conveyed yet another message, ritually and for the purposes of what think about themselves and what happened to us. So we're going to do it this way. We're going to sort of look at a few themes, and then we're going to read it together, and I'll go through it that way. Everybody has a text? All right. This chapter is split up into basically 3 or 4 different themes. It emphasizes our history in a way that the writers, the authors of this text wanted it to happen. It emphasizes our connection to the land, gratitude, specifically to God, and also covenant. So those are the things we're going to be looking for. So it actually details a ceremony that I wouldn't say average Jew, but at least the average male farmer was expected to do at what we would presume is Shavuot, the spring harvest. And it's the only place we have that in the Torah where a regular person is commanded to say something. Your minds might be drawn to the Shema, where it says, say these words and so forth, second paragraph, the Hafta paragraph, but that's kind of more of an interpretation. That's more like write them spiritually. This is actually, and we'll look at it right now, Deuteronomy 26, when you enter the land that your God, Yahweh, is giving you as a heritage, possess it and settle in it, you shall take some of every first fruit of the soil, harvest from the land that your God, Yahweh, is giving you, put it in a basket, and go to the place where your God, Yahweh, will choose to establish the divine name. That last little piece, by the way, always means the people who wrote this intended it to be centralizers of the cult, but they put it that way because they're reading it backwards before God points out that this is Jerusalem. But that's just a little trick to understanding Deuteronomy. So what do you do next? You go to the priest in charge at that time and say to him, and it says generally it's a Levite, we understand. It's not clear that this is the priesthood that we have, that we inherited and we even can talk about today. I acknowledge this day before your God Yahweh that I've entered the land that Yahweh swore to our fathers to assign. The priest shall take the brass basket from your hand and set it down in front of the altar of your God Yahweh. So that's the instruction of what happens with this ritual. The declaration that follows may actually be familiar. Recite as follows before your God Yahweh. My father was, and I'm going to give it to you in Hebrew first, an Arami Oved. An aleph, not an ayin. Arami Oved, a fugitive, a wanderer, somebody who was perhaps running away from something or just running around in circles, a fugitive Aramean. He went, we don't know. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there, but there he became a great and very populous nation. Remember, this is somebody reciting this. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us, but there he became a great and very popular nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to Yahweh, the God of our ancestors, and Yahweh heard our plea and saw our plight, our misery, and oppression. Yahweh freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm and awesome power, and by signs and portents, bringing us to this place, giving us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Wherefore I now bring the first fruits of the soil which you, Yahweh, have given me. Leave it before your God, Yahweh, and bow low before your God, Yahweh. Okay, so anybody recognize this? Exactly. It's from the Maxwell House Haggadah. Now, while they meet, and that was actually the joke I was going to use, but thank you. David studied with me too much. The Maxwell House Haggadah, of course, is based in its entirety and completely upon the traditional Haggadah of the rabbis. We're going to talk about that in a moment, but I want to stick to what we call the pshat of the text. Pshat, this is an important interpretive term in Jewish text. It means the simplest meaning of the text or the direct meaning of the text. It's a little bit of a hyperbole because you can't ever really know what that is, but it's at least what we try to do. So I'm not going to ask you a lot of questions, but I do want you to think about this story that this poor farmer has to say while he's sitting there with what had to be a fairly heavy basket of fruits. And I want you to think about what's missing. Something is missing in this story. Something big, something huge, something momentous. Anybody notice what it is? Think about our story. We were enslaved. God frees us. And then did we go right to the land? No. We wandered. Okay, well, the wandering, there's tales to tell, and they're in the Torah. But there was one tale in particular, it's told so many times and so circuitously. Yes, exactly, the theophany, the revelation of God at Sinai, it's missing. It's not part of this story here. Now, there's a number of reasons that may be true. Sorry? There were no plagues either. And by the way, there's very good reasons for that. And I think actually Tzemach Yoreh may have talked about that the last time we gathered, about the different lists of plagues that this prophet has and that book and so forth has. So that's a very obvious one. I am not at that level of scholarship, at least not today and not without a lot more preparation. But this much I could see, that there was no revelation at Sinai, or Chorev, as it's called in some places. Now there's a lot of reasons why this may have happened. Probably because it may have been a very different version of the story. For instance, Richard Elliott Friedman suggests, and this is a book very accessible to all of you, Exodus, that the Levites were the tribe that actually made the Exodus. Perhaps they didn't have that in their tradition. That might have been it too, but there might be another reason too. And the other reason is that they want. This was meant to be a story about land, gratitude for freedom, and gratitude for the milk and honey, and for the first, and not about the covenant in the sense of the law. Yes, the covenant in the sense of this is what, oh God, our gratitude for having, but not the individual laws, not the theology. Because after all, whether or not this is a different version, there were editors. Somebody could have put it in. They didn't want it. And what's the lesson from this? Even at the pshat level, even at the simple, let's try to understand this level, we have people molding our memory. Ritual, recitation of ritual recitation. We have people molding our memories in such a way that they want to get us to emphasize certain values. In this case, that value is gratitude to God for the land. And there's other values present here. Who are we, before whom are we making this, or expected to make this particular declaration? Where and how do we make this? Well, certainly we're saying it to God, but we're bowing low before God. But who are we giving the fruits to? The priest, the Levite, for their benefit, for their use. So it's a reinforcement of a hierarchical position of God, priest, and the farmer. And so this becomes also another way of reminding people where they stand. So that's one way that collective memory is framed in the texts that we have written before us, the Torah text. But there are other things that happen too. After this, the farmer does recite, does go through it. And you can look at the next part. It talks about that he did this, he makes a declaration that he did it properly and so forth. Jews like to do that anyway. And then as he does this, what he's sort of confirming is the covenant. And there's a little piece here that I'm having trouble finding. He talks about how I've eaten it and how I've done this properly and so forth. Then it talks about God's obligations to us and our obligations to God, their obligations to God, and that sort of completes the circle. A little ritual. That's basically how it ends. But I don't want to just end there, because we have to go to Maxwell House. We have to talk about the Haggadah. The rabbis preserved this. There was no temple any longer for anybody to go with first fruits. And anyway, even when there was a temple at the very end, it was more or less irrelevant to people's lives, and it was not an agrarian culture anymore. So who was going to come and bring this? By the time the temple's gone, the rabbis have completely repurposed, and a whole new message comes at it. There's a number of reasons why they put it in the Haggadah. One, I think because they felt strongly that this needed to be cited, that at some point we needed to say it, because it talks about that happening here too. But I think the main reason is because they wanted us to think differently about it. Remember, at this point, the land, while incredibly central, is not ours to farm in very part. And so that's that kind of gratitude, to express it that way, it seems more wistful and even more pressing. Because now what we're looking forward to more and more is a future. This is at a time when there's no freedom. And so thinking about a future redemption also makes us think about our own story. So if you recall the traditional Haggadah, some of you have read it growing up, and maybe you weren't even asleep during it because it was so early. We do those 4 questions, and then we get to what's known as the Magid, the tale, the story. And the story is not a story. It's not once upon a time, here's what happened. It's told very circularly. Also all these other stories about rabbis that get inserted in. But one thing that happens when they sort of kind of really close to the beginning, they tell the story of Abraham, and it's not from this, because this really, and I should mention this now, the Arami Oved, the wandering Aramean, most of us think that that was probably a reference to Abraham. Now, Aram and Mesopotamia aren't completely co-equal or coexist, but there's parts of it that. So that probably is what it really was. But they don't even go there. They just talk about Abraham separately, and then they get here to this part that you do hopefully remember. It says, go forth and learn what Laban, the Aramean, because he lived there, wanted to do to our father Jacob. Pharaoh had issued a decree against the male children only, but Laban wanted to uproot everything. And then it gives us that verse. As it says, Arami Oved Avi. Where are they getting this from? They're getting this from a retranslation, creative translation, not the real translation. What they're doing is they're changing wandering. That my father was pursued in destruction by an Aramean. What Aramean? Laban was. Why is this here? Well, the ambiguity of the Hebrew helps. It always does with Midrash, and that's what this is. But what they really want to do here is tell us that Laban was worse than Pharaoh. Why? Because he wanted to uproot the whole thing. He wanted us never to exist anymore. We had Abraham, we had Isaac, and now Jacob. He's going to uproot the whole thing. What's the significance of the Haggadah? What's the Haggadah about? It's about telling the sorry tale of our persecution. And it's doing that in the context of a time when people are feeling persecuted. That's the context when the Haggadah, as we know it, comes together. Not a late Second Temple thing. This is post First Temple. So it's been destroyed. We're in dire straits. There is a diaspora. There's Romans in charge, and things are getting worse. That's what led, of course, to the Bar Kokhba revolt and other miseries that the Jews had. So this fits in with that narrative. So now, rather than the pshat of the Torah, of gratitude for the wonderful land we live in, and here's the beautiful fruits that we just harvested, and thank you, God, for the milk and all the honey, fat and honey, Bill. Now, instead, it's all we've done is suffer. We've always managed to be freed from that. It's still about God rescuing us, but it's also about the possibility that we will see redemption. After all, that is really what the Haggadah is about. So how am I doing on time? All right, so I don't even have a couple minutes probably. The Passover story has within it an encoded tale of, additionally encoded tale of future. No longer just collective memory, it's collective memory in service of different than the original. Rabbis argued about something regarding the Haggadah. The wine. How many cups do we drink? There were those who said we should have 5. There should be a cup of future redemption. Each of the 4 cups represents a sort of phrasing of our redemption. Take things out of context, but they're midrashic in their. The rabbi settled on a compromise. There will be a 5th cup. That 5th cup will not be. What do we call that cup? Cup of Elijah. And why is it the cup of Elijah? Elijah represents the herald of the future redemption. Deuteronomy 26, this is my conclusion now, and I probably have 30 seconds to do it, shows how ritual can encode theological, historical, all kinds of social meanings, and the way that we read it, what we choose to include or exclude, how we choose to midrashically interpret or to ignore, in the case of the events of Sinai, that all of these are ways of telling our story to serve. That maybe doesn't feel appropriate for modern people. We're all going to be skeptical about this, but we do it all the time. It's the entire purpose of storytelling. What we do is also acknowledge that there's an historiographic, real set of events, and we want to learn from them too. That's why the book Zachor is valuable. And Yerushalmi, who was not a humanistic Jew, grappled with that because he came out of a traditional background and went into an academic pursuit of these texts at Columbia University, and he had to struggle with it. He had to struggle with many things, and I highly recommend this book. How we talk about the past is, and that for us today, it's never just about the past. How we tell our story, how we ritualize it, how we construct it is always just as much about the present as about the future. Jews, that is where land and memory and gratitude join with hope. That's how we use our texts, and I think that's a great example. How'd I do on time? Good, okay. On to number 27, chapter 27.
That was great. that really, what I
think we read into
where it's
everything.
not there.
No, the
Yeah.
covenant is there, because, and this is the part where I didn't have time, because if you look at the third paragraph, they're not numbered, but it does talk about God having fulfilled his end of the covenant by giving us the land. What's not there is detailed, almost individual, also collective, communal obedience to various laws. Not because they weren't understood to be there, they did not choose to emphasize. I wasn't clear about that. It wasn't a denial or a negation of the covenant, very much an embrace, but of an aspect of the land.
I just wanted to highlight one theme that you got to in the latter part of your presentation, and that's the importance of who's reading the text, what they read out of it. You know, it's not about what the text says even as much as who's reading it. You know, what does the Constitution say? Well, it doesn't really matter if you get to read it how you want to. You know, it's the authority of the person telling you what it means. And this is what we do with reading Torah as well. Ideally, you know, we do have a sense of that pshat, that this is what it actually says to the best we can know in the historical context and so on. But it's not illegitimate to read it in other ways. Sometimes we can be very picky in humanistic Judaism and focus on just, what does it say? Just the facts, ma'am, you know. And the reality is that these literary, creative, reinterpretive approaches are also valid contexts for reading a text, but we should be able to distinguish between the two. The last thing I was going to say is that's where, in modern theology, God has been changed quite a bit. Yeah. You know, to a force and the power for good, or the uplift that we feel in dark times. This is a story when God was really God, who punishes, who rewards with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. And I actually wrote an article some years ago called "Our Quarterback, Our King," because it just happens to be in our book, about the mighty hand and the outstretched arm. You know, that's when God intervened on the field instead of being a cheerleader on the sidelines. But the challenge when you're reading back that new theology into this text, it doesn't congeal, because this is when God was really God.
Well, that's what Sherwood talked about so often when he used the term kosherizing the text, right, to make it always reflect you. But that's not an illegitimate thing for a person who believes in God to do. I just wanted to briefly respond to what you said about the pshat. You know, I think it is important to understand the pshat, but the pshat is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of the story of who wrote it. And that we have this opportunity to understand what they were saying, and we have all these other tools available to us today of criticism, the not to criticize the Bible, but to deconstruct the Bible in parts when they were written. That allows us then to even go deeper than the religious sort of pietistic approach. So we have additional sets. What I think so great about our movement, those that came out of Reform Judaism, is that we encourage people to be. Don't believe that those will somehow spoil the spiritual message. And all right, I'm done. Thank you.
Yes, so I do want to point out that we have by Rabbi Dan called Recovery follow that you'll get something which yet. Okay, I'm sorry. So I think that that's really important, is that you are gathered to hear about a portion that honestly, I don't pay much attention to this portion. But that said, I've got curses. And and I'm kind of about it, to tell you the truth. But let's go through it. So as Adam had started out, this portion is Avo. That means when you come or when you enter. And at this point in their wandering, the people, they're in Moab because they're going to cross the Jordan River. And Moab, in our text, is a land with a really poor reputation. It is a place that Israelites are forewarned and told, do not do anything with Moabites. That is a bad thing. You should not marry, you should not be part of them. And then, the kicker is the book of Ruth. Ruth is a Moabite. She ends up being, great-grandmother of. Right? So you're kind of like scratching your head. What is this? Moabites? Yes, good, bad, whatever. So they're about to enter the land promised to them, and it's been described as a land. And that reference, the reference to land of comes from the story of the spies, Numbers 13. Only Joshua and Caleb, out of the spies that were sent, they are the only ones who report back the land. They use that very description. So I wanted to keep in mind that when I'm talking about different parts of the text, it wasn't written chronologically, it wasn't written in the order that we have edited, but it's important nonetheless to sort of see these phrases that come up more than once. So chapter 27 in Deuteronomy begins with the instruction that when the people cross the Jordan River, they are to inscribe stones with all the teaching, cover them in wax, and to build an altar of unhewn stone, those that are in unfinished form, haven't been cut with an chisel. And the 12 tribes then are divided into these two groups. And the first group is located on Mount Gerizim to hear the blessing. And the second group of tribes on Mount Ebal to hear the curse. Then but before examining them, it's important to go over a few fundamental rules of biblical interpretation that are very much applicable to this portion. The first is that when things are presented in a binary fashion, they're thought to be from a priestly author. Because the priestly authors, they saw the entire world in binary terms. It was their organizing principle. Any deviation from those two options, that was thought to signal cause chaos, catastrophe. For example, the story of creation in Genesis 1. There's light and darkness, day and night, evening and morning. There's male and female. There's good and evil. There's pure and impure. Here, the binary model is seen in blessings and curses. So even though the book of Leviticus, for instance, it's clearly a book from a priestly author, there are pieces based on that kind of structure. Second, there are biblical prohibitions against conclude that people, in all likelihood, were engaging in those behaviors. Because, you see, one doesn't prohibit something that isn't being done because it would only serve to suggest that behavior to them. So we can all recognize that when we admonish, don't go near that cookie jar, don't take a cookie, make that suggestion and now inform them there are cookies in the cookie jar. The kid already knows it, and that's why we're telling them don't. Finally, like the southern Judean writer is the north, Israel was destroyed in 722. That experience was set forth as a cautionary tale about how to avoid divine retribution and punishment. Because the destruction of the north, according to this theory, according to this author, it wasn't due to the superior military might of the Assyrians. Instead, it was due to the deviation from the law of the kingdom. So it was very important that the people living in the south, which is an existing portion of the that they have to adhere to the law. Look at all that. Look at what ensued. So, the commandments have to follow to the letter of the law in order to maintain their covenant with the biblical God and avoid the destruction that had come. So, with these preliminary conceptual concepts, let's look at the 11 specific behaviors and one general that the Levites shout to the people that if they did these things, they'd be cursed. And then the people are almost like to applaud. Amen. That's how they're supposed to respond. Amen. Now, there are a number of references to other parts of the Bible that will also give context so that these curses can be seen as shorthand for other passages. In other words, when we consider what's written in the book of Deuteronomy, the fact that it references, even though it's not with a footnote, tells us that that other section is keeping that in mind as well. And the book of Deuteronomy is referred to as the book of teaching. This is the book that's discovered by Josiah and is thought to be the book of Deuteronomy. And sort of in reference to the question about the voices of women, the book of teaching is taken to the prophetess Huldah for authentication, which again is kind of tells us the role of a prophetess and a literate woman, sort of be both, or else you couldn't authenticate something that important. Anyway, so as I said, it's a curious collection of particular behaviors that perhaps we can group by shared characteristics. The broad concerns of the biblical writer were idolatry, in order to establish the primacy of the biblical God, protection of the otherwise unprotected widow, orphan, and stranger, incestuous sexual behavior, intercommunal relations, and that catch-all, namely to maintain the covenant. So as set out in Deuteronomy 27, then the Levites were to loudly curse or encourage the curse of anyone who made a sculptured image, who insulted their father or their mother, moved a fellow countryman's landmark, misdirected a blind person, subverted the rights of the stranger, the fatherless, or the widow, lay with his father's wife, lay with an priest, lay with his sister, lay with his mother-in-law, strike down his fellow countrymen in secret, accept a bribe in a murder case, or, specific enough, otherwise not observe the commandments. Remember, we're told that at the beginning, all these things are put on mixing my metaphors, right? Inscribed on stone. And so the prohibition against sculpture is found in the second commandment. both Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5. While it says that it is graven images and sculptured image, it's actually a prohibition against idolatry, specifically set forth in Leviticus 26:9. That, in other words, what was prohibited, the writer knew there were other gods. They understood all of that. Worshiping those gods is what was being prohibited. Misunderstanding, even to this day, or the second commandment, gives rise to this notion of Jews being an iconic people without any. That's from biblical times all the way to modern. So the second one, insult to one's father or mother, would violate the fifth commandment to honor one's father and mother, again, 20, and obligation to revere them, not just honor them. It's set out in Leviticus 19. Moving a landmark is echoed in Proverbs 22, where one's enjoined from removing the ancient boundaries set up. That's kind of curious. What exactly where are these boundaries? What's going on here? And it's thought to be a reflection of the wisdom of ancestors, who must have had a pretty good reason to put up these physical boundaries. And then also apply that to the notion of other societal, moral, and legal boundaries. That we don't come from, we don't just sort of reinvent ourselves. We come from a tradition. There must have been some rationale. Some of them may make sense to us. Some of them, again, are head scratchers, and we have no idea. And other ones say, thinking of Proverbs, which is very much part of our wisdom literature, it was good wisdom. Let's not just get rid of it. The fourth conduct worthy of curse is misdirecting a blind person. And this derives from Leviticus 19, that insists that we should not insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. Now, it always struck me as a really curious prohibition, because the deaf would not hear an insult, and the blind, they're not going to see who put the stumbling block in front of them. So when I seek to understand that verse, I think it's to make each of us a better person, because we would know what we need. And in that betterment of ourselves, to keep us from engaging in such contemptible behavior that just exhibits a meanness, we're reminded how to be. That this would be that example. And that's why I think this curse comes up, because it's, again, it's a curious one. It's a curious part of Leviticus. And of all the curses that are going to get specified, that's the one they chose. So I do think it is to make us better people. Likewise, we are better people when we intentionally take care of the widow, the orphan, and the stranger among us. These are the people marginalized. These are the people, certainly in biblical times, that were at great risk, that were not profiting in a very broad way, enjoying the benefits of the status. And so I think that again, makes us better people. So the fifth type of conduct would be that, to protect and the four kinds of sexual misconduct echo prohibitions found in the sexual code of Leviticus 18. And furthermore, the specification about the sister, the definition of sister applying to the daughter of your father or your mother. By that definition, it applies to what we call a half-sister. And that idea, I think it comes from, again, in more linear fashion, but the awful story in 2 Samuel 13, when David's son Amnon rapes his half-sister, Tamar, and does so seemingly without any punishment because they weren't in full. You say it's an awful story because yes, she's raped, but then aftermath, her ability to go on with life. And finally, the last two together, tradition, justice, striking down a bribe from subvert the need for legal accountability when an assault is committed. Finally, we get the last prohibition, the breaking of the covenant. To do so in the ancient without their protection, they would no longer be chosen from all other nations for this unique covenant. Now, this Torah portion may seem like an obscure Torah portion, hard to reconcile in many ways with our humanistic philosophy, but this text is ours to interpret in our own way, and importantly, to give voice to our own understanding. We don't view the second commandment as a prohibition against images, as we don't fall victim to false gods reflected in celebrity or money, broad and second commandment prohibition of idolatry. We can ask, are we a better society when we abandon those cursed behaviors and come to the conclusion that the answer is yeah, we are. We really are. And I'm going by the 11th, not that last one, to maintain every other commandment and keep the covenant. Avoiding idolatry, protecting the most vulnerable among us, respecting the wisdom of our elders, and maintaining our judicial system with integrity help us to create a better world. Our reasons for doing it don't relate to obedience to a God, but instead to our moral and ethical obligations to others in order to create and achieve a more just society.
Thank you so much. It was so wide-ranging, and I just wanted to touch on one little part that I especially enjoyed, this idea of the aniconic God. I do think that actually Yahweh was for them an invisible God that had some prohibitions. But one of my favorite things to do is to challenge my colleagues in the Reform movement, where I come from, with the Micha Mocha. You know this song probably. Who is like you, O God, among the gods, O Yahweh among the gods, the Elim. And they have it so ingrained in their heads that it's talking about false gods, never taking into account the idea that these are real gods to them. And what you said was very, very important, that Yahweh was the God they were supposed to pray to. They didn't necessarily negate the existence of other gods. They didn't have a covenant. Anyway, thank you so much.
I also had a couple of thoughts. One was just to highlight where it says that you should not subvert the right of the stranger. In the Hebrew, the word that's used for stranger there in many cases is ger, which literally means the resident, alien, someone who is not part of your community but is living there and is part of your community in that sense. And so I think it's worth pointing out, particularly at this moment, that aliens do have rights, even in the Torah. The other detail I wanted to just hone in on is this question of the mountain, from the blessing and the cursing, but also going back to Jeff's chapter where he talks about the place where your name will be caused to dwell. This is a point of contention 2,500 years ago between the Judeans coming back from the Babylonian exile and a group of people called the Samaritans, or Shomronim, who have a shrine, but it's in the north, in a place called Samaria. And they have a mountain of blessing and a mountain of cursing, but it's the opposite of the one that we have in our Torah. They even have a Torah, except it's a hexateuch. With 6 books, it goes through the book of Joshua. It doesn't end at the end of Deuteronomy. Now, the fact that there are 18 million Jews in the world and about 18,000 Samaritans means that we claim our text is the correct one. But there is this alternate reading that it may have been, reversed. Again, it depends on not only who's reading it, but who's copying the text, because occasionally they could intervene and make those changes there. So that's, again, the power of the editor. Well, we have 15 minutes left in our session, so I'm going to telescope my comments down a little bit to make sure we have time for any last comments or questions. I'm looking at chapter 28 into 29. And I wanted to first reinforce the historical context that Jody talked about, the idea that you have to make sense out of destruction. You know, whether it's the destruction of the northern kingdom that the southern kingdom is trying to learn a lesson from, or perhaps as the editors of this text are looking at it after the destruction of the southern kingdom of Judah by the Babylonians and an exile that they experienced to another land, they're trying to learn a lesson. If we were destroyed, what did we do wrong? And if we get the chance to go back and rebuild, how can we avoid making the same mistake again? Because if we were destroyed for disobedience, then we'll be destroyed again for re-disobedience. The other thing that this chapter highlights, however, in a totally different category of thinking, is the literary power of language. In chapter 28 in particular, it's not just bullet points of cursed be this and cursed be that. It gets very creative and poetic in its metaphors and the imagery that it's presenting. And I want to highlight a few of those examples because I think they're both disturbing and powerful in their own way. And then the last thing I'll highlight about 28 is that it's reinforcing the concept of a covenant that's conditional. Some covenants are permanent. The covenant with the house of David, no matter what the house of David does, and they do plenty of things that are bad in the books of Kings, that is still given. It's not revoked because the Mashiach, the Messiah, is still Ben David, is still from the house of David, even looking forward into the eschatological future. But this covenant of being able to be in the land is conditional. And you can even find Orthodox critics of what's happening in the West Bank in Israel who draw on these kind of texts and say, we don't get the land no matter what. We get the land if we do right in that land. So that's the idea of a conditional covenant is one that people sometimes don't get. They think chosenness is permanent. But even according to the Torah, you're only a light unto the nations if you're a light, not no matter what you do. So let's take a look at the text in Deuteronomy 28. And you see very much in the very first line of this chapter, if you obey your God Yahweh to observe faithfully all the divine commandments, then, that's the deal, if then, he will set you high above all the nations of the earth, and all these blessings will come upon you. And hear how the poetic language of, it's binary, but it's also like complementary. This is how biblical poetry sometimes works. You say it in a slightly different way, but it's the same idea. Blessed shall you be in the city, and blessed shall you be in the country. Translation, everywhere. Blessed shall be the issue from your womb, the produce of the soil, the offspring of your cattle, the calving of your herd, the lambing of your flock, the basket and your kneading bowl. Your gathering and your wheat, and you'll be fertile and fruitful everywhere in every possible way. Blessed will you be in your comings, and blessed will you be in your goings. This reminds me of the Shalom Aleichem song, right? Boachem l'shalom, come in peace. Seitchem l'shalom, go in peace. That's the idea that no matter where you are, everywhere you will be blessed. Yahweh will put to rout before your army the enemies who attack you. I love this image. They will march out against you by a single road, but flee from you by many roads. They just run in all directions. Yahweh will ordain blessings for you upon your barns and upon all your undertakings, and even in the land that you're in. He will establish you as God's holy people if you keep the commandments and walk in God's ways. The idea of walking in the way, walking in the path, that's where the Hebrew term halakha comes from. Halach is to walk. It's also, by the way, the root for Sharia in Islamic law. It's also the idea of the path, or Tao. The Tao is the path. That there's a right way to do it, and as we'll see, do not turn to the right or the left. Stay on the straight and narrow, as we even say in English. Another imagery at the bottom of this page. Yahweh will open to you that bounteous store, the heavens, to provide rain for your land in season and bless all your undertakings. This resonates today. You will be a creditor to many nations, but a debtor to none. That's prosperity, right? Positive trade surplus. Yahweh will make you the head, not the tail. You will always be at the top and never at the bottom. Again, if, only if you obey and faithfully observe the commandments that I command to you this day, and do not deviate to the right or to the left from these commandments, and turn to the worship of other gods. Again, that jealous God who doesn't even want you looking at any other gods. But if you do not obey and faithfully observe these commandments, then we have more curses. Yay! Cursed will you be in the city, and cursed in the country. Again, translation, everywhere. Cursed shall you be in your basket and your kneading bowl. You can't collect from the trees, and even what you try to farm will fail. Cursed shall be your issue from the womb, your produce from the... It's like the opposite of what we saw before. Anything that I promised you to be good will come out poorly. And cursed shall you be in your comings and in your goings. Remember the army that was going to attack by one road and flee by many roads? Now, he will let loose against you calamity, panic, and frustration in all the enterprises you undertake. You will be utterly wiped out because of your evil doing in forsaking me. I will strike you, or Yahweh will strike you with consumption, fever, inflammation, scorching heat and drought, blight and mildew. They will hound you until you perish. And another beautiful and terrible image here. The skies above your head shall be copper, and the earth under you iron. No rain from above, and the ground as hard as metal. I will make the rain of your land dust, like the dust bowl. Sand shall drop on you from the sky until you are wiped out. So this is why we know this is also looking forward, not just looking back at the disaster. Because they weren't totally wiped out in that 722 conquest or even in the 586 destruction of Jerusalem. There were survivors that stayed on the land and survivors that were taken into exile. But this is saying if you go back and you mess up again, now you're really going to get it. You will be utterly wiped out because of your evil doing and forsaking. I will make pestilence cling to you until putting an end to you in the land you are entering to possess. So that's the negation, the end of the covenant. It will end you, and you will have no root in the land. He will strike you with all these inflammations and so on. Oh, I'm sorry, I jumped up a paragraph. Yahweh will put you to rout before your enemies. You will march out against them by a single road, flee by many roads. And you will be a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth. Your carcass is food for birds and the beasts of the earth, with no one to frighten them off. You won't even have a survivor tend to the bodies. You'll get the Egyptian inflammation. I'm not sure exactly what that is. Hemorrhoids, boil scars, itch, madness, blindness, dismay. And then here's, again, some of that powerful imagery. You shall grope at noon as the blind grope in the dark. Not just as the blind grope, but as the blind grope in the... You'll be so bad, it'll be like a blind person in a dark room. No hope. You will not prosper in your ventures, but be constantly abused and robbed with no one to help you. If one man pays a bride price for a wife, another man shall enjoy her. If you build a house, you shall not live in it. If you plant a vineyard, you shall not harvest it. Your ox shall be slaughtered before your eyes, but you will not eat of it. Your donkey seized in front of you, and it will not be returned to you. Your flock delivered to your enemies with no one to help you. Your sons and daughters delivered to another people while you look on. Your eyes will strain constantly, but you will be helpless. A people you do not know will eat the produce of your soil and all your gains. You will be abused and downtrodden continually until you are driven mad by what your eyes behold. Anything good will go bad. But this imagery is really powerful. The examples of your children will be taken away from you, and you pay a bride price. You build a house, but you don't get to live in it. And your ox is slaughtered, but you don't get to eat it. You see a disaster, you see something that could be to your benefit, it's going to turn to your disaster. You'll be afflicted with inflammations. In the middle of this second to last paragraph on this page, Yahweh will drive you and the king you have set over you to a nation unknown to you or your ancestors, where you shall serve other gods of wood and stone. You shall be a consternation, a proverb, and a byword among all the peoples to which Yahweh will drive you. This is where it strikes me as maybe at least this line coming from the Babylonian exile, where they've been conquered and the king has been taken away and they're taken to this other land far away by people who speak a language they don't know, and they become a byword to all the other peoples who say, look what happened to those Judeans when they broke the rules. Now, this is not the light unto the nations. This is like a black light unto the nations. This is what not to do. and all these curses will befall you. I'm sorry, there's more curses in that bottom part. Like you plant vineyards, but you don't get the wine. You have olive trees, but you have no oil. The cricket takes over the trees. The strangers in your midst rise above you. And again, this image of bottom on top, and you're falling down. And this will all happen because you did not heed Yahweh and keep the commandments commanded to you. They will be signs and proof against you and your offspring for all time. Again, we get the description. This is on the last side of the handout. A nation from afar will come from the end of the earth, swoop down like an eagle, a ruthless nation that will show the influential no regard and the vulnerable no mercy. Again, you get that everybody's included, right? The wealthy, doesn't matter. The poor, no pity. They all get destroyed. And then I'm going to jump through this next part because it describes what it's like to be under siege and to have no food. And then it says, basically, you'll have to eat your children. That's the punishment. You want the worst possible punishment? That not only that your children are suffering, but that to keep yourself, I mean, it's brutal. Now, we don't know if this is based on actual experience, but it's certainly the worst possible outcome that you could imagine. And again, it's a warning. If you fail to do this, this terrible thing will happen. And then in basically the middle of the page, this is the key point. As Yahweh once delighted in making you prosperous and many, so now will Yahweh delight in causing you to perish and in wiping you out. If God, well, you deserve it. That's the message. You deserve it. And he will have just as much fun stomping you out as he did encouraging you to flourish. You will be torn from the land you're about to enter and possess. He will scatter you among the people from one end to the other, and there you will serve these other gods. You will have an anguished heart and pine and a despondent spirit. The life you face will be precarious. You'll be in terror day and night with no assurance of survival. And again, this is a great phrase. In the morning you will say, if only it were evening. And in the evening you will say, if only it were morning, because of what your heart shall dread and your eyes shall see. Now, this is trying to explain why bad things happen. It's something that every religious tradition and philosophy has to do, to find an explanation. Why do bad things happen? Now, our response is, bad things happen. But from the Torah's theology, if they believed in a God that was just, then if there's a disaster, it must be because we did something wrong. And so this passage is trying to explain a disaster that's already happened by blaming the victim and saying you deserved it. Now, we don't find that psychologically healthy or religiously productive. But it's part of our tradition, and we don't get to choose. But my favorite part of this passage, and I want to end with this, is the beginning of Deuteronomy 29. Because Moses is kvetching. He's complaining. Moses summoned all Israel after all these blessings and all these curses and this review of history. You have seen all that Yahweh did before your very eyes in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and his courtiers and his whole country, the wondrous feats you saw with your own eyes, those prodigious signs and marvels. Yet to this day, Yahweh has not given you a mind to understand or ears to see, eyes to see or ears to hear. You just don't get it. You must be the slowest learners in the history of the world. Stiff-necked people, blind. Who needs to make you blind? You can't even see anyways. And I love when Moses sort of lets it out. Because he has endured this people for so long. And, you know, there's that story, that joke by Henny Youngman that some people think he's a pain in the neck and other people have a lower opinion of him. That's Moses and the Israelites, that they are a pain in the neck. And they just don't learn, and they just don't learn, and they just don't learn. But that's the human side of the story. A lot of passages in the Bible are commandments and lists of blessings and curses and God pronouncements, but then you get a bit of the human characters too. And there is an insight into the human condition. When Moses gets fed up and he expresses his annoyance with the people, and you think, yeah, if I were Moses, I might have felt the same way. So, any last thoughts on these portions?
At the risk of not being as humble as Moses, I think a lot of rabbis think of ourselves that way too when we're dealing. No offense. Okay, I do want to say something about connecting it back to about collective memory. This book doesn't just belong to us now, right? The book belongs to a lot of peoples, and unfortunately, even as these folks were thinking back to Assyria and possibly Babylon and forward to things that could possibly happen to them, when you hear this, you also hear the voice of the anti-Semite. The time when we're dealing with this right now very seriously, I see these themes now being thrown into our faces. And that's something I think it recommends to us to be aware of this historical context and to remind us that literature that we wrote for ourselves to be repositioned this way, maybe that is a little bit of a use of our text. I'll sleep.
All right. Well, it's 10:45. We're actually on time. Good job, everyone. I do want to ask, we can take a few minutes, maybe cut our break down a little bit. Are there any questions or comments that people here in the room have? Yeah, Adam. Yeah, so the comment is for those online, if you were living under pogroms, you were living under violent and unpredictable lives, this would sound prophetic, all this destruction and all these challenges that you're facing. And that's exactly how some people have read even events like the Holocaust, There are ultra-Orthodox sects in New York that have actually increased their barriers and their stringencies post-Holocaust because they blame themselves for having suffered during the war. The pantyhose that women have to wear have become thicker over years. The sleeves have become longer. So much so that they've actually had to learn how to use Photoshop and fix the pictures of the early generations of the Hasidic dynasty where the women wore short sleeve shirts. And now they have to make their sleeves longer to match the current ethos of that, frummer than frum. They have to be even more pious and more strict. But it's all a part of this theology of blaming yourself. And, this is why Harold Kushner wrote a wonderful book called When Bad Things Happen to Good People in the early 1980s. And I like that he titled it When Bad Things Happen. It's not, they do. It's not if. And it came out of his experience with a son who had progenera. I think it's a disease where you age very quickly. And he had to grapple with his faith in a God that intervenes in the world with this calamity of a child that didn't do anything to deserve it. And Kushner's solution was, in the end, this God of the punishing, rewarding doesn't fit reality. He still needed a God. He wanted a God that, comforts you and uplifts you at difficult moments, but it couldn't be a God that could intervene and chooses not to intervene. To say that God could interact and not act is an evil in its own way. We've all been grappling with this challenge of bad things happening. This is one version of it, to say I'd rather preserve the justice of God at the expense of my own integrity and psychological well-being, where others would reduce their God to create a space for bad things to happen, or in our case, learn to live without a God and find ways that we can provide comfort and help, that we can help the lame walk and the blind see it. It doesn't have to be a supernatural miracle. There used to be a slogan for the Technion University in Haifa which said, miracles happen, they take a lot of work. And I think that's our motto as well. Please.
Cohen, part of the tribe of Levi. Aaron was everybody else, his cousins, tribe. They have same tribe though, yeah. Different jobs in the same tribe. But those are.
Maybe summarize.
Yeah, so the question, the idea of substitute. No, I don't think so. Either on their own. I think this is an expansion because, of course, in the Torah, there's 13 commandments that cover a lot more ground than what we have in the 10. So, because I'm your mom, that's why. Right. And the rest give you all the different behaviors. But this is sort of the added consequences where they're, without necessarily giving us more explanation. That comes later, as far as what you can do in order to make sure you're not honoring the Shabbat. It doesn't tell us what you're doing. How do you honor intuitive what you're supposed to do, right? But honoring the Shabbat, that becomes a rabbinic.
Have stories here in our society, our secular society, bad things that are going to happen. Okay, that's what. But if you take a bribe, you're going to jail, right? Cursed will you be? Yeah. I'm just saying, it's not quite that different.
So the summary of the question, what are we supposed to do with these horrible stories, right? And they were methods. So for me, text really became accessible to me, it was the moment when I realized there's an agenda of the biblical law. And it's twofold. Theological, Israelites formed a nation distinct from the Canaanites from which they came. And so the Jews, they're emphasizing a single God, multiple gods, and one thing of covenant. There's a theological agenda, and then there's a political agenda at the time would have been to ultimately install the priests, of David, et cetera, right? And a lot of it, yes, it is. It's not a history, but what it will tell us is what was the agenda. Why did you have to be so harsh in this? Because if you want to make a break from something, maybe you have to be that it holds up because it is what I consider our sacred text. We're not rewriting the story. We don't take this text and take the book of God out to make it our we take it on its terms. And I think that recognizing that made it very, very accessible to me. It wasn't something that I had to just buy into or that political agenda. And then we can go from there with our own.
I'd also like to say, I never want to say it's only a myth, as if myths don't count, as if myths don't influence culture and society and expectations, possibility, imagination. I mean, does it matter whether Romeo and Juliet actually lived? Not sure. We can investigate, we can try to find out, that's worth doing, but on some level, the story is the story. And it resonates with the human condition. The stories that have survived resonate with the human condition in every culture. This past week, we observed Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Memorial Day. Did some of these passages describing these disasters resonate with some of the trauma that Jewish people faced even 80 years ago? Yes, it does, because bad things happen. And if our people wrote stories whose values we reject, if one of their core values was obey, we're not a fan of obedience, that's part of the human condition. It's a skeleton in our closet, you know. So I agree with what Jody and Jeff said, that these are our stories. We can grapple with them. We can agree or disagree with them. Maybe you prefer a Jewish cooking class to a Torah study class. That's fine. You don't have to do it. But it's part of the broad understanding of Jewish culture and inheritance to also look at these stories. And like it or not, other parts of the Jewish world are going to be reading these passages over and over and over again. And it's okay for us to read it once in a while. So that's what we've done this morning. So thank you very much for coming in. We'll take a maybe 10-minute break and then come back with our second session.
Not on the next panel, but thank you. I will keep that in mind going.
Very Jerris I'm familiar with. Yeah,
Yep, and it's also blowing unconditioned air. So if that's hooked up to an AC unit, that's not working either. Okay, gotcha.
I am starting. Are you talking about, how are you talking? I know, but I can't,
It's working when it's
are you, oh, and I'm
disconnected entirely.
talking about
Apparently not. Oops, I forgot to mute that.
started. In biblical eschatology, there's a concept of the saving remnant, the small survivors that manage to be sufficient to reestablish community. So maybe that's the people left in our session today. Anybody is not shy. Right. All right. Yeah, they'll miss. That's right. Their loss. Watch the tape.
They weren't there.
Okay. This morning, we took a look back at some of our earliest history as the Jewish people, but now we're going to be looking back at our history as the humanistic Jewish community. And I invite you to pity the receptionist at the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism who has to answer the phone, because it's a lot of syllables, although I think it's about even to the Congregation for Humanistic Judaism of Metropolitan Detroit, founded as the Birmingham Temple. That also has a lot of syllables. We seem to have a syllable session. In any case, 40 years ago, in 1985, a new institution for Jewish learning was envisioned and was begun in Jerusalem. 40 years later, in 2025, we've accomplished quite a bit, but of course there's still plenty more that we need to do to grow and to establish our movement. It's a great pleasure to welcome here today two people who were involved in some of the earliest stages of the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism, or IISHJ. Make sure we get through the program in less than 2 hours. We can use the acronym instead. And they've continued their connection with our movement through today through their work and volunteer service. Rabbi Miriam Jerris is Rabbi of the Society for Humanistic Judaism and Associate Professor of Professional Development at the IISHJ. And Julie Gales is the Madrikha, or Jewish leader, of the Jewish Cultural Society in Ann Arbor, where she served for over 25 years. Now, I have a confession to make that when the IISHJ was founded in the summer of 1985, I was 9 years old. So what do I know about that? And what I do know, I've learned from other people. But after all, often education is learning from other people and their experience and wisdom. And so with that, I turn it over to first Rabbi Jerris to talk about the beginnings of the IISHJ.
Notice when he spoke about Jody last night, he talked about how they're really friends, so he's going to call her Jody and not Rabbi Jody. But when he introduces his mother-in-law, he says, I'd like to introduce Rabbi Jerris. Just saying.
I can't wait. Can't wait.
Sign of respect.
Yeah, right.
Go with it.
So I want to thank you for inviting me to reflect on the past before my memory is completely shot. But it was a most exciting time in my life. Who here knew Sherwin Wine? Okay, so most of us. He was the primary creator of the secular humanistic Judaism alphabet soup that had a very ISHJ, AHR. Someday I'll do a talk on that. But what was really exciting about those times? Although we are celebrating IISHJ, there was a time of foundational work that happened before then. And I want to just comment on a few. In 1980, Sherwin invited Shulamit Alon from Israel to come here to the SHJ annual conference to speak about Israel, and she was a member of the Knesset. She was the leader of the Rights Party, which became Jerris, and I had the opportunity to. This was a big. I was still pretty much a volunteer at that point, and I really did like it. So I wrote this up. I still have the little 5 cards, comments on it, and thank you, Miriam. Now I can die. So if my bat mitzvah wasn't enough to make me want to be a rabbi, that was another moment when I said, aha, I really like it. In 1981, we met at Kibbutz Shefayim, which is right outside of Tel Aviv. And Shula had connected us to Gershon Weiler, who was a professor at Tel Aviv University. And the publicity, because, in Israel, everything is public, and everybody gets to know about anything that's happening. So we actually got publicity. And two members of which was the left-wing party at the time, contacted us. One was Buddha Bauer, and that created the first connection. Coming back to North America, in 1982, a bunch of us met at the New York City Jewish National Fund, and there was SHABBAT, which at that time was the Congress of Secular Organizations, Arbor Ring, Circle, Jewish Currents, Zionists, and at that point we established the North American Coalition that we called Leadership Conference. Now that organization came, but a few weeks ago, Jody, colleague, and I were speaking on the phone, talking about the importance of 40, and so I then had to. So in Numbers 32:13, the Lord's anger blazed against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years, until all the generation that had done evil in the sight of the Lord was. That fit this. So the number of 40 is significant in the Bible. It often symbolizes some other things, like a period of testing, trial, probation. It's associated with change, transition, or new beginnings. And it's frequently used as a period of time, marking a shift to a new phase or event. That really, and I saw how it connected in a way that I often see how things connect. That's part of what as it is with many, we looked at the 40 years and said, we don't have to wait for 40 years before we start working on it. We're going to do it now. And here we are 40 years later, where we can take time and consider what happened. In 1985, now I was in Israel in 81, and I just assumed I was in Israel in 85. I was in 7. So I went looking through my photo albums to meet, and I could not find one piece of material evidence that showed that I was there. And there are no traces in my memory. Yes, but those two together. So I wasn't there. But, and in the 1985 issue we called Israel, Sherwin spoke about it. He said, in July 85, leaders of the Israeli Association, together with the leaders of the North American Society for Congress, and Americans for a Progressive Israel, as well as Jewish humanists from England, France, and Argentina, met at the Hebrew University to establish a school and research center for secular Judaism. Excitement was high. Most participants saw the new International Institute as a joint project to bring secular Jews all over the world to a working relationship. Why? Why? After all, establishing and maintaining a school of higher learning is no easy task. Given the effort that would be required, the mere desire to create some kind of group solidarity was not a sufficient reason. It's the work that counts. When the idea of an institute first emerged sometime before the '83 meeting, certain compelling reasons presented themselves. Both secular and humanistic Jews in the world are unaware that they are who they are. The, quote, believers who do know what they are often lack the knowledge or training to give depth to their convictions. Both groups need education, and effective education requires the planning and focused creativity that only a school can provide. Secular humanism needs intellectual outreach. It needs to recruit and use the enormous number of Jewish men and women in the worlds of academia, writing, and the arts who see themselves as secular Jews, but who are so dispersed that they have no opportunity for dialogue with peers who share their outlook. Who knew Zoom was coming? They often have no motivation to promote their Jewish convictions because they are unaware of any audience or community structure that would give their efforts. If it were possible to recruit 1/10 of the available secular Jewish academicians for the task of explaining and enriching the humanistic point of view, it would constitute a formidable intellectual voice in the Jewish community, especially in Israel, where the secular commitment has been intense and widespread for many years. The number of potential talks about the projects they were going to do, two in particular. Neither of them happened, but what did happen 10 years later, Adam spoke about last night, is this, the Judaism in the secular age. And it's wonderful. It's all individual articles written by the people that were prominent in the movement, and don't ask how many. And very few. I was active at that point, but I guess my writing wasn't quite. But in the back of that are the first 5 statements that were issued by National Federation, which at this point, at one point they were kind of separate, like we did an International Federation program conference one year, next year. So now it's all together. But so that was 1995, and 40 years later, what is? I talked a little bit about that. Beautiful book. That still it's such a statement for where we've come and how, I mean, some years ago, we talked about the Federation calling us kid, part of our mythos, and but this is so 1985, 1986, we had a conference here, and in 1988, this was one of the most profound memories that I had. We established a conference in Brussels, and while I was looking for material evidence of my involvement in the 5 conference, I found none. But here we are in '88, well not, but Sherwin, Wine, like we're Sherwin Wine and Buddha Bauer and David Lisk at Brussels Secular Organization, which still exists. I had somebody who became adopted to Judaism last week who said he just joined that organization. Who is a Jew for me is like my foundation. And the air was very profound. Both her and I at a memorial, Holocaust memorial there. The best were Brussels. So it was a terrific. And I think somebody made the statement as how do we identify as Jews? We affirm that Jew is a person of descent, or any person who declares for herself to be a Jew, identifies with history, ethical values, culture, civilization, unity, and the faith. Fast forward to 19. We developed the North American Rabbinic Program. There was never a requirement for a rabbinic candidate to be dating or married. That's a really good thing for me, because if it was, and so I admire that very much. A special leg. There are other rabbinic programs that require that. The other interesting thing about what we required, we were very concerned about being, so we required PhD from an accredited university in Jewish studies. And first rabbi who was ordained received that, and after that, Adam and I always wanted. So we program, but we realized what that was, especially because so many people are moved later in their life with a lot of, like we had somebody, attorney, somebody who had a PhD in sociology, that couldn't quite fit. So I think that was a very good say. What you get when you become a Reform rabbi, in letters, so so once this program started and I started going to classes, I reminded myself of the fact that when I was 13 bat mitzvah, my Orthodox grandfather, who drove to temple on a Friday night to see a bat mitzvah, came up to me afterwards and said, with his accent, they say that that women shouldn't read from the Torah, but if they do it as well as you do, I don't see why not. So that kind of gave me ancestral permission to go on. So Adam, I, and Rabbi were in second class, and then we graduated on the first time, and we have 20 ordained rabbis through the last years. Watching Sherwin in action, seeing all these incredibly was pretty exciting for a woman early, and it was like an eye-opening, opened up to the possibilities that as a little Reformed Jewish girl in Western Ontario, I could never. And that has been the gift of me, a reflection of how it has really hope that I
I'm loud. I'm Julie Gales. As Adam said, I'm the Madrikha and Arbor Society. I'm really honored to be asked to provide some thoughts about the beginnings of the leadership training program. Miriam did not talk about because she jumped the program founded as part of our overall. I grew up in a secular Detroit. Sherwin Wine was a childhood friend of my father's, Harold, who's known as Red for reasons. Only in this space does this come up, right? Okay. So my father's parents were from Bobroysk, White Russia, which is now Belarus. My mother's family was from Lodz, Poland. On my father's side, I'm a fourth generation secular. My mom's grandparents were religious, but her not so much. It wasn't very easy being during the Depression when you worked for the federal government. Despite my father and Sherwin being lifelong friends, my family joined the Parents Institute in Detroit. I graduated from them. Did not have a bat mitzvah. At the time, we thought the concept of bar or bat mitzvah was simply too religious. We felt the same way about the observance of Yom Kippur, which we pronounced Yom Kippur. The reason why I'm starting out with a bit of personal history is because our community, the secular Jewish community, or our community, the secular Jewish community, and the humanistic community, were not always in alignment. Some of it was our history, that is, histories or origin stories of our own lives, communities, and alignment. Some of it was a singular lack of understanding or communication. Some of it was the personalities of our leaders and the leadership styles of our national organizations. Some of it was how we approached Jewish cultural expression and ritual. However, the one area where there was absolutely no disagreement was related to education and the need and desire to develop educated leaders who could support and transform our own Jewish communities and our congregation. So my father, Harold, started the Congress of Secular Jewish Education, CSJ, in 1970, to create a network of schools rooted in the Shalom movement. He wanted to bring like-minded secular Jews together to share ideas, teaching materials, holiday programs, and social justice activities. This should sound. Shortly after, it became the Congress of Secular Jewish Organizations, and it had about communities across the United States. At about this same time, a little bit earlier, 1969, Wine started the Society for Judaism. Both headquartered in Detroit, Michigan. Both looking for ways to connect people who were interested in celebrating Jewish culture and identity in an authentic, honest, and non-theistic way. These North American movements, CSJO and SHA, had annual conferences which included workshops on a variety of educational, cultural, and historic topics. But those of us who were running the conferences and managing our schools wanted more resources. We wanted leaders who could help shape the curriculum. In our Sunday school, we wanted adult education and discussion groups. What we really wanted was to be as learned about our form of Jewish life as our religious counterparts. So we sought a robust, secular, academic approach to learning about Jewish culture, philosophy, history, Israel, politics. We kept pushing our movement leaders to develop a rigorous training program, and ultimately they did, and they held the first seminar, a Hamish-style seminar in the home of one of the leaders of the CSJO, Philadelphia. I was corrected this morning. I thought it was 86. My memory isn't as good as it used to be. It was 7. You'll forgive me, I was 26. I was one of the youngest, if not the youngest, participants there, and I was in my second year of a graduate program at the University of Michigan in geological science. So my memories of the actual seminar are, I honestly don't recall the topic per se. I'm sure somebody has it documented. Thank you. I'm gonna assume, well, this was the first time I had ever heard of Ahad, father of cultural Zionism. Very first time. So I have to assume the theme was something related to Israel, as we had literally several fantastic teachers from that first seminar, many or people who had lived in Israel for an extensive SJO, the EVCAT, Abe Glazer, international law attorney, who was very involved in Zionism and also in secular Jewish community in Canada. Max Rosenfeld, a scholar, translator, and educator, and of course, Rabbi One, who I called Sherwin. Although friend, I still called him Sherwin, only publicly. In truth, much of the content that weekend was over my head. I remember reading the course back on the plane to Philadelphia without a lot of time to process the content. So much information being communicated to us in such a short amount of time. I mean, the seminars, the workshops literally went from first thing in the morning till 9 or 10 o'clock at night. We were overwhelmed. It was huge tidal waves of information. It was overwhelming. Exhilarating, absolutely, but over. I remember we sat around Bess and Marty's dining room table for some of the sessions, and other sessions we sat in their living room talking and questioning. I was usually sitting on the floor. I was scribbling notes. We were interjecting thoughts. Many of us knew each other from the National Umbrella Organization conferences that we attended. But that learning, at least the community of students who continued to attend and ultimately graduated with a close-knit group of friends who continued to enrich each other's lives. We have lost many of those early attendees, and the rest of us may not see each other very often, but when we do, it's like no time has passed. And we have always been very supportive of sharing our materials, ceremonies, celebrations, holiday observances amongst ourselves, and I think that is really an important part of what this overall community is. I think it's important to note that what I lack in memories of the educational does not diminish the power of the memories of how I felt about the first IISHJ seminar experience. I think most of us can conjure up a memory that floods us with feelings, that brings a smile to our face, or transports us back to some moment. The first IISHJ seminar has that effect for most of us. Even at the time, it felt historic. Like we were experiencing a sea change in our Jewish communities and ourselves. It was like a dream come true for so many of us in the room, from a nascent idea of having a path to Jewish knowledge that wasn't steeped in religion, to gaining a true community of students hungry for knowledge, straight through to establishing an authentic professional life where Jewish practice matched our humanistic values. It was profound. It was awe. I want to backtrack for just a minute. I indicated that a lot of the push for the IISJ was to create a religious, academic training ground, and that was absolutely true. But I want you to remember the cultural experience for North American Jews in the 1960s. The Jewish community was struggling to address the growing intermarriage issue. Jews were falling in love with non-Jews, and the Jewish community leaders were very concerned about Jewish continuity. Remember that, Jewish continuity. Rather than considering that the Jewish community grows and gains support as Jews marry outside the Jewish community, they were concerned about losing Jews to other faiths, or which is one of the ways we ended up where we are today. Most rabbis couldn't conduct a marriage couple. Sure, the couple could go to a justice of the peace, or they could go to the courthouse and be married by a judge. But if the couple wanted any form of Jewish or otherwise, it wasn't. There were a lot of secular humanistic Jews who are married. Several of us, a couple of us on the day, many more in the room, perhaps. And at the time that the IISH started, many of the students also wanted to support by being able to function professionally, appreciate events. I think that continues to be a drive for many of the From a singularly, I was committed to providing life services to my Jewish community, give back to those who are so important and transformative in my life, and my way of thinking about the world. The knowledge that we were on a journey to help our communities was also an underlying driver that made those early seminars. So I don't know if we appreciate it at the time, but the SHJ and the CSJ found common ground in pursuit of education and leadership development. And importantly, as vital and a vital space for those providing support, leadership, celebrating their Jewish lives. The early IISJ seminars not only imparted knowledge, but also fostered a transformative experience of aligning personal and values while contributing to shared and authentic professional. They played a crucial role in empowering and enrich the local community legacy and camaraderie. And I just want to reflect on something that Jeff said to us this morning. Because when Adam and Miriam and I started talking about what we were speak about this morning. I had to share some of the thoughts, because we lost a lot of people. What I was going to talk about, and I started reflecting about what I really remember about the first seminar. Almost public. But it's really the memories and the feelings of those memories that is important. That's also us, the way we connect to our Jewish life. But what Jeff said was profound. He said, molding our memory what we were doing in those seminars. Right here. The other thing he said is discussing our past is never just about also about and our hope. And I think that that really is a great message. How this transformed the world and the
So I'm going to pick up the story from the early to mid-1990s when I broke Julie's record for the youngest student in a leadership program seminar, being an undergraduate and taking it way too early. But I got a lot out of it. And I also had the experience of multiple faculty from differing perspectives. In my case, it was Sherwin Wine on one side and Herschel Hartman on the other, who were both intellectual giants who didn't learn how to share in kindergarten. So that's right. So it was an interesting model of both collegiality and competition, diverse perspectives that got along but didn't always get along. But more importantly, it was a creative time for me in thinking about what this identity meant and what kind of a leader I could be. I want to highlight a few of the milestones that took place in these last, say, 30 years. From the mid-1990s. Miriam already mentioned the publication of our anthology, Judaism in a Secular Age, but that really launched a whole series of publications that we brought out, including teacher kits on our basic philosophy and our intellectual and historical roots. We later published an anthology of humanist readings in Jewish folklore, and a whole series of books that were proceedings from major colloquium conferences. We have some examples of those books on our table today. But that was the other major leap forward in the mid-90s, were these colloquium conferences, where we brought together several scholars, and if you thought 2 days of dawn to dusk learning was intense, this was like 4 days of dawn to dusk learning with multiple scholars and discussions and responses. And you can experience them now virtually because we put all the videos up on YouTube, and you can see what it was like in that time, and it was really a dynamic period. And we covered all kinds of topics, from Jewish history and identity to the question of secular spirituality. What are the lessons we learn from biblical archaeology, and how do we incorporate those into Jewish community and even issue advocacy? We had one conference on the twin poles of anti-Semitism and intermarriage, where they love us, they hate us, they love us, they hate us. We had a seminar on, and a colloquium on Jews in the Muslim world. We held one on the children of intermarriage. It was called, quote, half Jewish, question mark, which some people like that label and some people hate that label, but the point is the phenomenon is there. And we covered a wide variety of interesting topics. By the 20-teens, the turnout for these colloquia had gone down significantly, so we sort of sunset that program. But it really represented a 20-year period of fruitful creative work and also outreach into the academic world, where we brought in a lot of important scholars and thinkers to inform our ideas as well as to share our ideas with them. So we were, again, looking for wider recognition, wider understanding, and deepening our sense of education for our students. And also, one of our core mission elements is providing adult learning opportunities. That's why we publish the materials. That's why we held the colloquium conferences. Beginning in the early 2000s, we also took a leap forward in terms of the broader Jewish world. We had our first Israeli rabbi ordained in 2003. That was Sivan Malkin Mas. And she inaugurated a new parallel institute in Israel. The initial Israeli Association for Humanistic Judaism collapsed for a variety of reasons in the early 1990s. And then for a time in the late 1990s, there was an organization called Meitar, which was a college for Judaism as culture, which was an institute affiliate in Israel, and that also went its own separate ways. So in the early 2000s, we had another IISHJ in Israel starting called Tumurah, which means change or transformation in Hebrew. And it was the dawn of training Israeli secular humanistic rabbis, which took some adjustment in Israel because people said, well, if you're secular, how can you have a rabbi? They see those as oppositional, just like we had in this country as well. And so then the response to them was, well, what would you call someone who runs a community, who teaches, who provides life cycle support, who provides counseling and identity information? And I mean, if it quacks like a rabbi and it walks like a rabbi, I mean, maybe you could use the Sephardic community uses the title Chacham, which means a sage. But I don't know about printing up business cards that say sage. You know? It just feels a little egotistical, maybe. But in any case, that program started, and they had their first ordination of 7 students in 2007 at the Israel Museum. And they had a really fortuitous moment because one of the chief rabbis in Israel called the Attorney General and tried to get them to stop the ordination ceremony because they said it was perpetrating a fraud on the Israeli public to call these people rabbis when they were secular. And so the Attorney General's office looked in the Hebrew Encyclopedia and said there's nothing about God in the definition of rabbi in the Hebrew Encyclopedia, so it's okay. But it made the news. So we said, thank you, Chief Rabbi. It worked out great. It was a really momentous experience. It was a very powerful moment, and evidently Sherwin had gone to teach over the summers a couple of times for these students as well. They came here for a learning experience too for one of the colloquia, and it was the beginning of a beautiful friendship that continues to this day. But that summer of 2007 was also one of the hardest moments in our movement's history, and that was when Sherwin died in Morocco in late July, August? Yeah. And it was a very challenging moment for all of us who knew him, of course, but also institutionally. You know, he was the founder, he was the founding ideologue, he was the motivator, he did a lot of the work. I used to joke all roads led to Sherwin when it came to movement activities. For good and for bad, you know, it could be a bottleneck for things getting done, and everything had to be handwritten. Even his emails he would print out and then handwrite a response, and then the secretary would type them back in to get those emails back. But it was a challenging moment for us, and we actually had a meeting at a restaurant that used to be down the street. I like the name, Annapolis. That's right. That was the site of many meals for movement events. But we had a sort of informal dinner there with a number of the leaders who were in town for the funeral, and someone asked, you know, how do we answer this question of who's going to replace Sherwin? And the answer I came up with was none of us and all of us. That no one person is going to do it, and that wouldn't be a good thing anyways. But all of us together. I mean, he trained other leaders. That was the point, right? Nobody lives forever, even the founder. And we have to now enter this new stage of our movement's life and experience. And that's when I really think the Institute entered the 21st century. Number of ways. First of all, I do my email myself. So I don't have to type it out. We started developing ebook editions. Whenever we brought out a new colloquium text, we brought out an ebook edition as well because people read those. And it actually doesn't hurt print sales as much as people thought it would. And some of those ebook editions were actually done in partnership with SHJ and with CSJO to bring out some of their older print books in a new ebook edition so that, again, it would be the old wisdom but provided to a broader audience and reaching new people. We inaugurated a YouTube channel, and we used to sell we used to sell audio tapes and VHS tapes, but we had been selling DVDs of our colloquia over the past years, and we weren't selling very many of them. And so we thought, you know what, let's just make it available. And we took those videos. I had a high school intern work on them, and he downloaded, digitized all the material and put it up on YouTube with captioning now that's automatic. And all that wisdom for all those events of all those hours, now you don't have to watch it in a 4-day period and cram it in your head the way it happened originally. Now you can watch it slow. You can even slow down or speed up the playback speed. There's all kinds of ways to get the learning. That's the point. Adult learning was always part of our remit. It used to be in-person seminars, but now it can be done on your own pace. Whatever you're wearing is up to you, and you can watch the videos on your own. We began shifting how we did rabbinic and leadership training because there's this thing called the internet. We started with a program called WebEx, which some of you may have used, and then we ultimately moved to Zoom, actually before the pandemic, so I knew something about Zoom before the pandemic happened. I was like 6 months ahead of everybody for a little while. But the idea was that we have rabbinic students all over the country, and they're not necessarily going to move to Michigan to take classes. We were lucky that one of our students had left Michigan, but received an inheritance that helped her to afford to fly back periodically to come in for a class a day a week or 2 days a week. But that we couldn't sustain that, and we knew we needed to reach out to students who weren't local. We couldn't demand people coming in for weekends. There's only so much you can do in a weekend. So in the end, we shifted to online education with some intensive in-person classes, and that's how we teach even to this day. We also felt it would be necessary to consolidate some of the organizations and some of the programs that we offered. So initially, we had a leadership program and a spokesperson program and an educators program and a rabbinic program. Well, we decided to consolidate a bit. So we consolidated the spokesperson and educators into the leadership program. But there's also a new desire that people have, and that's to become an officiant. They want to lead life cycle ceremonies. They're not involved in running a community. They don't need to run a Jewish school or lead holiday celebrations, but they want to be able to provide a meaningful service at a memorial or for a couple getting married or a child arriving in the world. And so we developed what we call the Life Cycle Officiant Program. We looked at what other programs were out there. You know, there's everything out there from advanced certificate programs to you pay $25 to the Church of Judaism and you get ordained as whatever title you want, from a beadle to a druid. You can pick, you can be whatever title you want. I know some people have ordained their pets through that system. So we wanted to find the right balance of access, but high quality training and giving people the skills they needed to do a good job out there in the world. And so we developed the Life Cycle Officiant Program. I see us also moving us into the 21st century. A few years ago, we engaged a social media company to help promote us. We had a Facebook page, but it was not doing much. And the social media company we've worked with has helped develop content, kept us on schedule of regularly posting, has greatly expanded our audience. And again, that's part of spreading the message, but also providing a service to our members who want to know what's happening in the movement. And just this last month, we brought out a brand new website. Our previous website was 12 years old at this point, which is ancient world of websites. And this new website reorganized the structure to include our professional programs, include our publications, but also to highlight all the resources we have for individualized adult learning. They're organized by topic and by material, audio, video, written material to read, books to buy. It's all organized so that individuals can have their own Jewish learning journey. And we include our contact information on those pages to say, when you finish this, we have more. There's always more to read. Traditionally, you did that with the Torah. You turned it and turned it. You could always study it again and again. Well, that's the Jewish experience for us. There's always more to find. And our job as an institute is to help you in your Jewish learning journey to find more about what you want to discover. So we're trying to meet all of these objectives: the professional training, the adult learning, the publishing materials, and broadening awareness of the movement. What does the future hold for the Institute? Well, we're beginning the process of blending our rabbinic seminars with simultaneous and what's called asynchronous learning. Used to call it a correspondence course where you just did it on your own, but now there's all kinds of videos from all kinds of Jewish studies departments and history departments out there that our students could watch on their own and then discuss together, but we don't have to be in class for every single hour that the students are learning to be a credible, credited program. So we've started that process of redesigning our programs, our curricula, to meet that need, and again, be more flexible and affordable for the students. We're working at integrating the outside graduate level study that our rabbinic students get when they have to get an outside master's degree in Jewish studies with our own course requirements. I mean, why should they take our Bible class if they just did a master's degree focused on the Hebrew Bible? They don't need to do that. They have that information. It's rethinking what it means to ordain a rabbi, not by us cramming the information we want into your head, but do you have the competency in the areas you need to be a functioning and effective leader? And there are many ways to get that. It's not only one way with one class that you have to take and read the same books that everybody has read who went through the program. And finally, we're pushing for our place in the Jewish world. That includes that publicity, that includes recruiting more students in more areas of the world, but it also includes things like this contemporary humanistic Jewish publication. Technically, the Institute didn't pay for it directly, but what they did was they helped collect donations to support the expenses of promoting and developing the book. It's providing a clearinghouse for the sales of the book at special events. It's promoting the book through its catalog and its website, because this is a part of our movement. It's out there in the world, and if we're part of these anthologies of Jewish thought alongside the conservative and Orthodox and Reform Jewish movements, then we've arrived in a way that we always wanted to and always deserved to, but hadn't quite made it that far. And our hope is that this opens the door for appearing in modern Jewish thought classes and other seminaries programs. They should read us just as we read them. That's the next step forward, so that in the long run, we will have people from other movements who, if they evolve in a more humanistic direction, already know where to go. And we will no longer see those op-ed pieces that seem to come out every 2 or 3 years saying, well, I was raised religious, but I'm not that religious anymore, so I'm going to make it up myself. We're here. We've been here. Now, the fact that you haven't found us is partly our fault, but there's something called Google. See what you can find. So hopefully, in 40 more years, I hope to be here, but even more so, I hope that there will be fewer and fewer people out there who are having a new discovery of humanistic and secular Judaism, but rather saying, oh, I heard about that, that's who I am, where do I find the next step? Thank you very much for coming for our Shabbat learning this morning. I know the SHA board meeting has their lunch after this. Our book table will be open for our last round of sales if anybody's interested. Thanks to those who joined us online as well. And please wish Shabbat Shalom to the people sitting near you.